The first letter had come with the spring thaw, a crack in the ice of Eli Carver's solitary life. It smelled faintly of lavender, and the paper was smoother than anything in his cabin. He read it by the light of a kerosene lamp, his calloused fingers tracing the elegant script. A woman from Georgia, a widow named Annabelle, would be his bride. He had sent the money to the agency months ago, on a lonely winter night when the silence of his homestead felt like a physical weight. He was a man of 35, with lines etched around his eyes from the sun and a quiet that had settled deep in his bones after the war. He owned 160 acres of hard-won land, a sturdy cabin he'd built with his own 2 hands, and a loneliness that was beginning to feel less like freedom and more like a cage. He needed a wife, a partner. He read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and tucked it into the empty coffee can where he kept his important things. He imagined a woman with soft hands and a gentle voice, someone to fill the echoing space beside him. The second letter arrived 3 weeks later, tucked in with a seed catalog and a flyer for a new patent medicine. This one was different. The paper was coarse, the handwriting hurried and blotchy, as if written on a tipping table. It confirmed the arrival of his bride, a farmer's daughter from Ohio named Clara. Eli stared at the name, a cold knot forming in his stomach. He unfolded the first letter, smoothing it out on the rough-hewn table. Annabelle, Clara, 2 different women, 2 confirmations, both addressed to him. He walked outside and looked at the vast, empty prairie, stretching out to a horizon that promised nothing but more of the same. It had to be a mistake, a fool's error back east by some clerk who couldn't read his own ledger. He wrote a letter that same day, a short, simple message pointing out the error. He sent it with the mail rider and tried to put it from his mind. Surely it would be sorted. These things happened. But a letter took weeks to travel, and the stagecoach, he knew, was faster. Dead Horse Gulch was not much of a town. It was a dusty street with a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a church with a steeple that looked like a splinter against the enormous sky. When the weekly stagecoach from Cheyenne pulled in, it was an event. Eli was there, his horse tied to the hitching post, his good hat brushed clean. He stood apart from the small crowd, a habit he'd fallen into long ago. He was a respected man. He kept to himself, paid his debts, and could break any horse without breaking its spirit. Folks nodded to him, but they didn't pry. The coach door opened and the first woman stepped out. She was tall and slender, dressed in a dark traveling dress that, while dusty, was clearly of fine make. Her hair was the color of autumn leaves, pinned up in a way that spoke of careful breeding, and she held her head high, though her eyes scanned the rough town with a nervousness she couldn't quite hide. This had to be Annabelle, the widow from Georgia. She looked exactly as he had imagined, a fragile bloom in a desert of dust and grit. Then a second woman emerged from the coach. She was younger, with a sturdier build and hair the color of sun-bleached straw, pulled back in a simple, severe braid. Her dress was plain, homespun wool, and her hands were chapped and red. She carried a small, battered valise, and her eyes, a sharp, clear blue, held no nervousness at all, only a hard, defiant watchfulness. She looked like she'd been in a fight with the world and had not yet decided if she'd won or lost. The station master, a balding man named Silas, consulted his clipboard. "Eli Carver," he called out, his voice cracking with uncertainty. Eli stepped forward, his heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. "That's me." Silas wiped a sweaty palm on his trousers. "Well, Eli, seems we got your delivery, both of them." He gestured helplessly from the refined redhead to the sturdy blonde. "Mrs. Annabelle Clayton, from Georgia, and Miss Clara Mae Brown, from Ohio. Both say they're here for you." A murmur went through the small crowd. Mrs. Gable, the storekeeper's wife, pressed a hand to her mouth to hide a gasp. Two men leaving the saloon stopped, their laughter dying in their throats as they turned to stare. The situation hung in the air, thick and unbelievable. Annabelle's face, already pale, lost its last trace of color. Her gloved hands tightened on her reticule. "There must be some misunderstanding," she said, her voice a soft southern whisper that was nearly lost in the wind. Clara said nothing. She squared her shoulders and stared directly at Eli. Her chin lifted. It wasn't a plea in her eyes, but a challenge. She had the look of a cornered animal, ready to bite the hand that tried to send her back. Eli felt the weight of every eye in town. He was a private man, and this was a public spectacle. He could see the whispers already forming on their lips, the judgments hardening in their eyes. He could send one back. That was the proper thing to do. The agency had made the mistake. They could fix it. He looked at Annabelle, at the quiet desperation behind her genteel facade. She was a widow, fleeing poverty and the shame that came with it. Then he looked at Clara, at the faint, old bruise high on her cheekbone that her hair didn't quite hide. She was running from something, too, something mean and violent. He saw it in the set of her jaw. He couldn't send them back, not like this, not to whatever they were running from. He drew a long breath, the dusty air filling his lungs. "There's been a mistake with the agency," he said, his voice low and steady. "Meant for them and not for the gawking town." He cleared his throat. "You can't stay here in town. I've got a cabin. There's room enough." He looked from one to the other, his gaze direct and honest. "You can have shelter there, just until things get sorted." It wasn't a promise of marriage, but it was a promise of safety. Annabelle let out a shuddering breath, her shoulders slumping in relief. Clara gave a single, sharp nod, her expression unreadable. The whispers in town turned into a low hum of scandal. Some of the church-going women spoke of sin and impropriety. Others, mostly the men who spent their days leaning against the saloon wall, watched with a kind of grudging amusement, placing silent bets on how long it would last. Eli ignored them all. He loaded their meager belongings into the back of his wagon and helped them up onto the seat without a word. The ride to his homestead was a silent one. The land grew emptier the farther they got from town. The landscape whittled down to essentials: dry earth, stubborn scrub brush, and an endless sky. The wind was a constant presence, a low moan that carried the scent of dust and distance. It was a cold, unforgiving land, and Eli could feel their city-bred sensibilities shrinking from it. There was no easy life here. Survival was a daily negotiation with the elements, a bargain struck with hard work and resilience. His cabin stood alone in a slight depression, sheltered by a small stand of cottonwoods near a creek that ran thin in the summer. It was a simple, sturdy structure of logs he had felled and notched himself, with a stone chimney and a single window on either side of the door. To Eli, it was a fortress of solitude. To the two women, as they looked at its small, unadorned form, it must have seemed like the end of the world. A horse and 2 milk cows watched them from a corral, and a few chickens scattered as the wagon pulled up. Inside, the cabin was one room, clean but stark. A cast-iron stove stood in one corner, a rough table with 2 chairs in the center. A bed, neatly made with a patchwork quilt, was built into the far wall. A rifle rested on pegs above the door. It was a man's space, smelling of wood smoke, leather, and coffee. The first few days were a study in discomfort. The cramped space felt smaller with every passing hour. Eli gave them the bed, separated from the rest of the room by a blanket hung over a rope. He took a bedroll on the floor by the hearth. The nights were filled with the unfamiliar sounds of 2 other people breathing in the darkness, the rustle of fabric, a quiet sigh. Outside, coyotes yipped and howled, their calls sounding unnervingly close, a wild chorus that reminded them all of how far they were from everything they had ever known. Their personalities grated against each other like stones in a tumbler. Annabelle, used to a life of quiet refinement, moved with a delicate grace that was entirely unsuited to the rough cabin. She tried to maintain her manners, saying please and thank you for every little thing, a formality that felt strange and stilted in the face of their situation. Clara was her opposite. She was blunt and direct, with a restless energy that made her pace the small floor. She spoke little, and when she did, her words were clipped and practical. She watched everything with an unnerving intensity, as if assessing every threat. Eli, caught between them, retreated further into his own quiet nature. He was a man who communicated better with horses than with people, and the cabin was now thick with unspoken tensions and clashing expectations he did not know how to navigate. He did what he knew best. He assigned chores. Work was the great equalizer on the frontier. The results were disastrous. Annabelle, who had likely never done a day of manual labor in her life, was terrified of the livestock. She approached the milk cow as if it were a grizzly bear, and the chickens scattered from her in a flurry of squawking feathers. Her hands, soft and pale, were not made for wringing a chicken's neck or hauling buckets of water from the creek. Clara, for all her toughness, was just as lost in the kitchen. She had fled a life of hard farm labor, but it had clearly not included cooking. She burned the cornbread to a black crisp and made coffee thick enough to use as axle grease. The salt pork she fried was so hard it nearly cracked a tooth. She swore under her breath. Her face flushed with frustration, and slammed the skillet down on the stove. Despite the awkwardness, a fragile routine began to form. They shared their mostly silent, often burnt meals at the table. Eli would show Clara how to bank the fire in the stove at night, his large, capable hands guiding hers. He would patiently demonstrate to Annabelle how to gather eggs without startling the hens, his voice low and calm. They were small, practical adjustments, tiny threads of cooperation being woven into the frayed fabric of their lives. One afternoon, a loose shingle on the roof began to rattle in the incessant wind. Without discussion, Eli climbed the ladder, and Clara and Annabelle passed the hammer and nails up to him, working together in a smooth, unspoken rhythm. For a few moments, they were not two rival brides and a bewildered cowboy, but simply three people fixing a roof. Then the windstorm hit. It came on suddenly, a dark wall of dust and fury rolling across the plains. The sky turned a sickly yellow-brown, and the wind screamed like a banshee, tearing at the little cabin. It was a brutal, violent storm, the kind that could strip a place down to its bones. The rattling shingle was ripped away, and soon others followed. A draft snaked through the chinking in the logs, and the fire in the stove guttered and smoked. "The barn will be safer," Eli yelled over the roar of the wind. "The hayloft is sheltered." There was no time to argue. Shielding their faces with their arms, they fought their way through the blinding dust to the barn. Inside, the air was thick with the sweet, dry smell of hay, but the noise of the storm was muffled. The animals were restless in their stalls, their eyes wide with fear. Eli lit a lantern, its golden glow pushing back the shadows, and led them to the ladder to the loft. They huddled together in the hay, the wind shrieking outside, the old barn groaning under the assault. The temperature had plummeted. Annabelle was shivering, her fine dress offering little protection. Clara, though she tried to hide it, was trembling too, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Eli took off his heavy sheepskin coat. It was his only one, worn soft with years of use. He draped it over both their shoulders. It was a large coat, big enough to shelter them both. Annabelle sank into its warmth with a grateful sigh. Clara resisted for a moment, then relented, pulling a corner of it tighter around her. They sat pressed together in the near darkness, a strange trinity of strangers bound by a storm. The coat smelled of leather, wood smoke, and Eli. Annabelle found herself breathing it in, a scent that was solid and real and deeply masculine. It was nothing like her late husband's cologne. This was the smell of the earth, of work and survival. Clara felt the solid warmth of his body next to hers, a proximity that was both frightening and strangely comforting. The men she had known were rough and careless. Eli was still, a quiet mountain of strength beside her. Hours passed. The storm raged on. In the flickering lantern light, their eyes met over the collar of the shared coat. Annabelle looked at Clara, seeing not a rival, but another woman, just as cold and frightened as she was. Clara looked back and saw past the fine dress to the fear in Annabelle's eyes. And they both looked at Eli, the man who had offered them shelter when the world had offered them none. He wasn't looking at either of them, but staring out at the storm through a crack in the barn wall, his profile grim and determined. In that moment, a look passed between the two women, a silent acknowledgement of their shared predicament, their shared protector. It was a look that held a question neither of them could have put into words, a flicker of awareness that was as new and unsettling as the storm itself. The storm finally broke just before dawn, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and unnaturally quiet. As they climbed stiffly down from the loft, the day felt different. The air between them had shifted. Later that morning, Clara watched from the cabin door as Eli gentled his horse, which had been spooked by the storm. He moved slowly, speaking in a low, soothing murmur, his hands moving over the animal's flank in long, steady strokes. There was a power in his touch, but it was a quiet power, a tenderness she had never witnessed in a man. He could calm a half-wild beast with the palm of his hand. She wondered, for a fleeting moment, what that hand would feel like on her. Later, as Annabelle stood by the cabin's small, warped mirror, pinning up a stray strand of her auburn hair, she caught Eli's reflection. He was standing by the hearth, watching her. It was not a leering or improper stare. It was quiet, intense, and deeply observant, as if he were trying to memorize the curve of her neck or the way the light caught in her hair. When their eyes met in the mirror, he did not look away immediately. A slow warmth spread through Annabelle's chest, a feeling she had thought long buried with her husband. It was unsettling and confusing, but it was undeniably there, in the small, silent cabin, under the vast and empty sky. Something new and dangerous had begun to take root. The silence in the cabin changed after the storm. It was no longer just an absence of noise, but a space filled with things left unsaid. The women began to watch Eli, not with the initial apprehension of strangers, but with a slow, dawning curiosity. They saw the quiet strength in the set of his shoulders as he chopped wood, the rhythmic swing of the axe, a testament to a power he held in reserve. They saw the patience in his hands as he mended a bridle, his fingers, though thick and calloused, moving with surprising dexterity. Most of all, they noticed the stillness in him. He never raised his voice. In a world that had been loud with cruelty for Clara and loud with judgment for Annabelle, Eli's quiet was a balm. It was a landscape unto itself, vast and peaceful, and they found themselves drawn to it, like weary travelers to a sheltered valley. He spoke when necessary, his words plain and chosen with care. He would point out a hawk circling high above or explain why the creek ran higher after a rain, sharing his knowledge of the land as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Annabelle, who had been raised on poetry and clever conversation, found a different kind of eloquence in his simple truths. Clara, who had known only curses and commands, heard a respect in his tone she had never been afforded. He treated them not as burdens or temptations, but as people. Slowly, cautiously, the fear in the cabin began to be replaced by a fragile, tentative trust. One evening, while preparing their meager supper, the knife slipped. Clara was trying to slice a tough winter squash, her frustration mounting with each failed attempt. A flash of anger, born of a lifetime of being told she was clumsy and useless, made her push harder than she should have. The blade skittered off the hard rind and sliced deep into the fleshy part of her palm. She cried out, a sharp intake of breath, and dropped the knife with a clatter. Blood welled up instantly, a shocking crimson against her skin. Annabelle gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Before either of them could properly react, Eli was there. He moved from his seat by the fire with a swiftness that belied his calm demeanor. "Let me see," he said, his voice low. Clara instinctively tried to pull her hand back, to hide the wound and the weakness it represented. "It is nothing." He ignored her protest, his gaze firm but not unkind. Gently, he took her wrist. His touch was warm and solid. With his other hand, he guided her to the wash basin. He pumped fresh, cold water over the cut, his movements economical and sure. The sting made Clara flinch, but he held her steady. He tore a clean strip from a worn linen shirt he kept for rags and carefully blotted the wound, inspecting it in the lamplight. "It is deep," he said. "Needs binding." He fetched a small tin of salve that smelled of pine and herbs and began to dress the wound. His fingers, which could tame a wild horse and split an oak log, were impossibly gentle. He worked in silence, his focus entirely on her hand. Clara watched him. Her breath caught in her throat. She could feel the roughness of his skin against hers, the contained strength in his grip. He was so close she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, the faint scar that ran along his jawline. When he finished wrapping the bandage, his hands did not immediately let go. They stayed, cradling hers, his thumb stroking softly over her wrist. It was not a long time, perhaps only a few heartbeats, but it stretched into a silent eternity. In that moment, there was no Annabelle, no cabin, no harsh world outside. There was only the warmth of his hands on hers, a quiet current passing between them that was more powerful than any words. He finally released her, his gaze lifting to meet hers before he turned away to put the tin back on its shelf. Clara stood frozen, her hand tingling not from the cut, but from his touch. The following week, they had to go to town for supplies. The flour was low, and they needed salt and kerosene. The scandal that had been a low murmur on their arrival had grown into a steady hum of gossip. As they walked down the dusty street toward the general store, Eli in the middle, Annabelle on one side and Clara on the other, conversations stopped. Windows were suddenly filled with curious faces. Mrs. Gable, who had gasped when they first arrived, now stared with cold, hard disapproval. Inside the store, the air was thick with it. Men tipped their hats to Eli, but their eyes slid past him to the women, lingering with a mixture of contempt and crude curiosity. While Eli spoke to Mr. Gable about a new plowshare, Annabelle moved to look at a bolt of calico fabric, her fingers tracing the simple pattern. She heard two women talking in the next aisle, their voices low but carrying clearly in the small store. "It is a disgrace," one whispered, keeping them both out there, like they were livestock. "That one," the others said, and Annabelle knew she meant her. "Was a respectable war widow. They say her husband died a hero. Look at her now, gone feral, living in sin with that man and some little stray from up north." The word struck Annabelle like a physical blow. Feral. The word echoed in her mind, ugly and sharp. All her life she had clung to her respectability, her good name. It was all she had left after her husband's death and the subsequent loss of her home. To hear it stripped away so casually, to be reduced to a creature, an animal, broke something inside her. She turned away from the fabric, her eyes stinging with tears, and fled the store. She sat in the wagon, her back rigid, and wept in silence, her face hidden in her hands. Clara heard the whispers too, but where Annabelle felt shame, Clara felt a hot, familiar rage. She had been judged and found wanting her entire life. She would not stand for it here. As she waited for Eli to pay, a rough-looking ranch hand named Jebediah, who had been drinking at the saloon, swaggered into the store. He looked Clara up and down, a smirk on his face. "Well now," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "if it ain't Carver's little harem, tell me, which one of you warms his bed on Tuesdays?" The store went silent. Mr. Gable froze, his hand halfway to the money drawer. Clara's head snapped up, her blue eyes turning to ice. She did not say a word. She walked straight up to Jebediah, and before he could react, she drew back her fist and punched him squarely in the jaw. It was not a ladylike slap, but a hard, solid blow, thrown with the full force of her body. Jebediah staggered back, shock and pain on his face, and tripped over a sack of beans, sprawling onto the floorboards. A collective gasp went through the store. Eli was by Clara's side in an instant, his hand on her arm. "Clara," he said, his voice low and urgent. "He had it coming," she spat, her chest heaving. Jebediah scrambled to his feet, his face turning purple with rage. "Why, you little—" "That is enough," Eli said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the tension like a blade. He stepped between Clara and the ranch hand. He was not as big as Jebediah, but there was an authority in his stance that made the other man pause. "We are leaving." He put the coins on the counter, grabbed the sack of flour, and guided Clara out of the store, his hand firm on her back. The ride home was heavy with a new kind of silence. Annabelle was still wrapped in her quiet misery. Clara was vibrating with leftover fury. Eli's jaw was tight, his knuckles white on the reins. The peace of their isolated world had been shattered. The town was not just a place for supplies, it was a threat, a constant reminder of how unacceptable their lives had become. That night, after a supper eaten in near total silence, the tension in the cabin was unbearable. Annabelle felt the walls closing in, the whispers from town, the pastor's disapproving visit earlier in the week, where he'd suggested one of them ought to be sent back on the next coach for the sake of decency. It was all too much. She felt herself fading, becoming the shamed, feral creature they called her. She looked at Eli, sitting by the fire, his face grim in the flickering light. He was her only anchor in this storm, and she feared she was losing him. Later, when the cabin was dark and the only sounds were the crackle of the dying embers and the breathing of the others, Annabelle slipped out from behind the curtain. She could not bear to lie there alone with her fears. She pulled on a shawl and went out into the cold night air, heading for the barn. She knew Eli often went there before turning in, to check on the animals. She found him in the soft glow of the lantern, running a brush over his horse's back. The rhythmic, scraping sound was soothing. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. "I could not sleep," she whispered, her voice trembling. He stopped brushing the horse and just watched her. The air was thick with the scent of hay and animals, a smell that had once been foreign and now felt like a strange kind of home. "They will make you send one of us away," she said, the words tumbling out. "The pastor, the women in town, they will not let this be." "I will handle it," he said, his voice a low rumble. "How?" she cried, taking a step closer. "They think I am. They think we are." She couldn't finish. She looked at his hands, one holding the brush, the other resting on the horse's powerful shoulder. Hands that were strong and gentle, hands that could protect, in a moment of pure, desperate impulse. She closed the distance between them and laid her own hand over his. His skin was warm and rough. He flinched, but did not pull away. She looked up at him, her eyes pleading in the dim light. "I do not want to sleep alone tonight. Eli," she whispered, the words a raw confession of fear and a deeper, more profound loneliness. "Please." He stood completely still, a statue carved from frontier hardship. She could see the conflict in his eyes. He was a decent man, a man who lived by a simple, unspoken code, and she was asking him to break it. He started to shake his head, a slight, almost imperceptible movement. He opened his mouth to speak, to say no, to send her back to her bed and her lonely fears. But then he looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw not the scandal the town saw, but a woman trembling on the edge of an abyss. A woman who, like him, was profoundly alone. The resistance in his face crumbled. The hard line of his jaw softened. He let out a long, slow breath, a white plume in the cold air. Then he leaned down and blew out the lantern, plunging the barn into near total darkness. He did not say a word. He did not have to. He took her hand and led her not toward the ladder of the hayloft, but toward an empty stall filled with clean, sweet-smelling straw. Clara had been lying awake, staring into the darkness, her mind replaying the scene in the store. The rage had cooled, leaving behind a familiar, hollow ache. She had fought back, but it had solved nothing. A noise from the cabin door, the soft click of the latch, made her sit up. Through a gap in the blanket curtain, she saw Annabelle's silhouette slip outside. A knot of unease tightened in Clara's stomach. Worried, or perhaps just restless, she pulled on her boots and followed. She crept to the barn, the cold ground seeping through the thin soles of her boots. The door was ajar. She peered through the crack, in the faint moonlight filtering through the loft window. She saw them, two shapes, two figures becoming one in the shadows of the stall. She could not see their faces, but she saw Annabelle's head fall back, and she saw Eli's broad shoulders stooped over her. There was no sound but the rustle of straw and a soft, desperate sigh that was stolen by the wind. Clara backed away, her hand pressed to her own mouth to stifle a cry. She felt a coldness spread through her that had nothing to do with the night air. It was the chilling certainty of being left behind. Again. She turned and fled back to the cabin, slipping behind the curtain and pulling the rough blanket over her head, as if she could block out what she had seen. But the image was burned into her mind. The next morning, the air in the cabin was so thick with unspoken things it was hard to breathe. Annabelle moved with a new, quiet radiance, a soft glow about her that she tried to hide behind a veil of guilt. She would not meet Clara's eyes. Eli was grimly silent, his movements stiff and deliberate as he made the coffee. Clara was a block of ice. She answered questions with a single word or a nod. Her movements were sharp, her face a hard, unforgiving mask. She ate her breakfast standing up, then took the water buckets and marched to the creek, her back ramrod straight. Eli watched her go, the knot in his own gut tightening. He knew what this was. He had caused it. He found her by the creek, staring into the trickling water as if searching for answers in its murky depths. "Clara," he said, his voice gentle. She did not turn. "Leave me be." "We need to talk." "There is nothing to talk about," she said, her voice flat. "She got what she wanted. You got what you wanted. It is simple enough." "It is not simple," he said, stepping closer. He could see her shoulders trembling. "Clara, look at me." She finally turned, and her face was a wreck of unshed tears and raw pain. "What do you want me to say?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "That I am happy for you? That I understand? I saw you both in the barn." Eli had no words. He could only stand there, the truth of her accusation hanging between them. Tears finally spilled over, tracing clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. "It is not your pity I want," she choked out, her fists clenched at her sides. "I have had enough of pity to last a lifetime. For once, I wanted to be the one someone chose, not the one left over, not the one they send back." Her voice broke on a sob, a raw, painful sound that seemed torn from the very center of her. She was not just crying over him and Annabelle. She was crying for a lifetime of being second best, of being unwanted, of being the daughter a father beat and the bride nobody claimed. It was a confession of a hunger so deep it had shaped every hard line of her body and every defiant glance of her eye. And it left Eli Carver standing on the banks of the frozen creek with an impossible choice and the devastating knowledge that, in trying to shelter them both, he may have broken them instead. The silence that followed Clara's confession by the creek was a living thing. It settled over the small cabin like the first hard frost, coating every surface, chilling every interaction. Words, once spoken, could not be taken back, but they could be buried under the slow, heavy work of survival. And survival was what the land demanded now. The wind grew teeth, biting with a cold that promised worse to come. The sky turned a permanent, unforgiving gray, and the first snows dusted the high plains. A stark white sheet laid over the dead. Brown grass. Winter had arrived. The cold was their new enemy, a relentless thief that stole the warmth from the cabin the moment the fire in the stove burned low. The floor was a river of drafts, and Eli's bedroll by the hearth offered little comfort. He watched the women huddled in his bed, wrapped in every spare blanket they possessed, their breath pluming in the frigid air. He saw the way they shivered. Even in sleep, a man could endure the cold. He could tough it out, but watching them suffer it was a different matter. Without a word of explanation, he spent 2 days working. The sharp, clean scent of pine sawdust filled the cabin as he sawed and planed the boards he had stored in the barn. He worked with a quiet, single-minded focus, the muscles in his back and arms moving with practiced efficiency. The women watched him, a silent audience to his solitary labor. They did not ask what he was doing. They simply kept the coffee hot and the stove fed, moving around his workspace with a new, careful grace. When he was finished, he had built a double bunk bed against the far wall, where his own bed had been. It was a sturdy, practical creation, unadorned but solid. The lower bunk was enclosed on 3 sides, a cozy, protected space. The upper bunk was more open to the rafters. It was an ingenious solution to the problem of space and warmth, creating 2 distinct sleeping areas while still concentrating their body heat in one corner of the room. "You two take the bottom," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "It will be warmer." He slung his bedroll into the top bunk. That night, for the first time, the women shared a bed. They lay stiffly at first, each keeping to her own side of the narrow mattress, a canyon of unspoken resentments between them. But as the night deepened and the cold seeped in through the log walls, a shiver racked Annabelle's body. A moment later, another took Clara. Without a word, Clara reached out and pulled the top quilt more securely over Annabelle's shoulder. Annabelle murmured a thank you into the darkness. It was a small gesture, a truce brokered by the cold. But it was a beginning. A new rhythm took hold, born not of friendship, but of necessity. The close confines of the cabin during the long winter days forced an intimacy upon them. They learned the cadence of each other's breathing, the sound of each other's footsteps on the floorboards. A kind of domestic treaty was drawn, its borders defined by shared chores. Annabelle, whose initial attempts at cooking had been disastrous, found a surprising aptitude for it now. With a sack of flour, a side of salt pork, and a few precious jars of preserved vegetables, she began to create meals that were not just edible, but comforting. She brought a quiet order to the cabin's interior, mending their clothes with neat, tiny stitches, her needle flashing in the lamplight. Clara, in turn, took over the more physical work. She seemed to draw strength from the cold, her cheeks chapped red, her body alive with a restless energy. She chopped the kindling, her axe strokes sure and steady. She hauled the water from the half-frozen creek, her shoulders straining but never failing. She learned to bank the fire so it would last through the night. They moved around each other in a silent, efficient dance, their animosity buried beneath the shared goal of getting through the day. Eli watched them, his face impassive, but a measure of the tension eased from his shoulders. The cabin, for the first time, began to feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a home, however strange its foundation. One afternoon, with a rare winter sun casting long, blue shadows across the snow, Eli decided to hunt for rabbits. Their supply of fresh meat was gone. "I could use another gun," he said, looking at Clara. "The rabbits are quick this time of year." Clara's eyes lit up with a flicker of something other than resentment. Annabelle, who flinched at the sight of a plucked chicken, recoiled. "I will stay and bake bread," she said quickly. Out in the woods, the silence was different from that of the cabin. It was a clean, cold silence, broken only by the crunch of their boots in the snow. Eli moved with a hunter's grace, his eyes scanning the brush. He handed Clara a small rifle, lighter than his own. He showed her how to hold it, how to brace it against her shoulder. His hands covered hers on the stock, positioning her fingers. The shock of his touch, skin to skin in the biting cold, was like a spark from a flint. She could feel the warmth of his body behind her as he leaned in, his voice a low murmur by her ear. "Breathe out slow," he said. "Squeeze the trigger. Do not pull it." They walked for an hour before they saw anything. A flash of white against white. A snowshoe hare, frozen in place, its nose twitching. Eli nodded at her. Clara lifted the rifle, her heart hammering against her ribs. She remembered his words, his touch. She breathed out, the world narrowing to the small, trembling creature in her sights. She squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle shot was shockingly loud in the stillness, and the rabbit fell. A wave of triumph, fierce and hot, washed over her. She had done it. She had provided. Eli gave a low whistle of approval. Good shot. Praise was a foreign currency to Clara. She did not know what to do with it. She looked at him, her face flushed with the cold and the pride, and she saw him looking back at her with an expression she had never seen before, a genuine, unguarded respect. On impulse, driven by the wildness of the day and the fire of her success, she took 2 steps toward him, reached up, and kissed him. It was not a soft kiss. It was a kiss of defiance, a staking of a claim in the frozen woods. It was hard and hungry and tasted of cold air and gunpowder. For a moment, he was completely still, his body rigid with surprise. He did not kiss her back, but he did not push her away either. His hands, which had been at his sides, came up as if to grip her shoulders, then stopped, hovering in the space between them. When she finally pulled back, they stood in the snow-dusted silence, their breath mingling in the air, the dead rabbit lying between them like a sacrifice. When they returned to the cabin, the savory smell of baking bread met them at the door. Annabelle looked up as they entered, a smile on her face. Then she saw them. She saw the way Clara refused to meet her gaze, the high color in her cheeks. She saw the grim, conflicted look on Eli's face. And she saw the single rabbit he carried. 1 gun, 1 rabbit. A story was told in that silence. The smile on Annabelle's face faltered and died. Jealousy, cold and sharp as an icicle, pierced her heart. It was a bitter, ugly feeling, and it was followed swiftly by a wave of crushing despair. That night, as the women lay in their bunk, the silence was a wall of ice. Annabelle could hear Clara's steady breathing, and she hated her for it. She hated her for her strength, for her fierceness, for the easy way she fit into this hard world. Annabelle felt like a ghost, a pale imitation of a wife, clinging to the edges of a life that was not hers. She had brought nothing here but her sorrow and her soft hands. Clara had brought a survivor's spirit, and Eli, a man of the frontier, would surely choose the survivor. The next morning, Annabelle waited until Clara had gone to the creek for water. Eli was cleaning his rifle by the fire. She approached him, her hands twisted in her apron. "Eli," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "I believe it is time for me to leave." He looked up, his movements ceasing. "Leave? Where would you go?" "Back to town," she said, her eyes fixed on the floor. "I can find work, mending, perhaps, or helping at the boarding house. It is not right, me being here. It is causing trouble." "We are already trouble to the town," he said flatly. "This is different," she insisted, her voice gaining a desperate edge. "It is not fair to her, to Clara. She belongs here in a way I never will. I see that now." "It is better if I go." It was the most selfless thing she had ever done, and the most painful. She was offering to cut out her own heart to stop the aching. Eli put down his rifle and stood up. He was a tall man, and he seemed to fill the small cabin. He looked at her, his expression uncharacteristically fierce. "No," he said. The word was a stone dropped into a still pond. "But—" "I said no." He took a step toward her. "I am not sending you away. Not now. Not ever." He raked a hand through his hair, a gesture of profound frustration. He looked from her to the door, as if expecting Clara to return at any moment, and then back again. He lowered his voice, but it held an intensity that made her tremble. In plain, simple, cowboy honesty, he said, "I do not want either of you gone." The words hung in the air, a declaration as solid and real as the log walls around them. It was not a solution. It was not a promise of love. It was a statement of fact, a truth he had finally admitted, perhaps even to himself. He needed them both. The refined, gentle woman who had brought a whisper of civilization and warmth to his hearth, and the fierce, wild woman who had brought a fire and a strength that matched the land itself. He did not know what to do with this truth, but he would not run from it. He would not let either of them go. Before Annabelle could process this, the world outside went white. A blizzard, which had been a threat on the horizon, descended upon them with stunning ferocity. The wind howled, a physical force that shook the cabin to its foundations. Snow began to fall, not in gentle flakes, but in a thick, blinding curtain. Within an hour, the landscape had disappeared. They were trapped. The first day was tense. They played a few listless games of checkers, the silence between moves stretching for long minutes. The second day, the enforced proximity began to wear on them. Tempers frayed. Clara snapped at Annabelle for humming. Annabelle criticized the way Clara stacked the firewood. Eli, caught in the middle, retreated into a stony silence, his jaw tight. The cabin felt like a powder keg, the three of them circling each other, waiting for the spark. By the third night, the storm had not abated. The wind shrieked, and the snow was piled halfway up the door. They were running low on firewood. A deep, primal fear began to creep in, overriding their personal grievances. The storm was no longer an inconvenience. It was a mortal threat. Sometime after midnight, a great gust of wind hit the cabin with the force of a battering ram, and a section of the roof over the main room gave way with a sickening crack. Snow and freezing wind poured in. In that moment, everything changed. Panic gave way to pure survival instinct. "The loft!" Eli yelled, grabbing the lantern. "It is the strongest part of the barn." They fought their way through the blizzard, the short distance from the cabin to the barn an epic journey. Inside, they scrambled up the ladder to the hayloft, the same loft where they had sheltered once before. They burrowed deep into the hay, huddling together for warmth. The three of them, a single, shivering island in a sea of cold and noise. The anger and jealousy and tension had been scoured away by the storm, leaving them raw and vulnerable. There were no more pretenses. There was only the howling wind, the darkness, and the desperate need for another's warmth. Sometime in the deep, frozen hours of the morning, Annabelle began to cry, silent, shuddering sobs of fear and exhaustion. Without thinking, Clara reached out and took her hand, Annabelle's fingers laced with hers, clinging tightly. Eli, sitting between them, felt the shift. He looked at them in the faint, dying light of the lantern. Two women, so different, yet bound together by his indecision and the fury of the elements. He felt a surge of protectiveness so fierce it stole his breath. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment in the air. Then, with a reverence that was almost painful to behold, he laid his hand on Clara's arm, his thumb stroking the worn wool of her sleeve. His touch was not one of passion, but of deep, aching tenderness. It was an apology. It was a promise. It was an acknowledgement of her pain. Clara stopped shivering. She looked at his hand on her arm, and then she looked past him to Annabelle, who was watching them, her own tears frozen on her cheeks. Annabelle's grip on her hand did not loosen. In that moment, in the heart of the storm, a silent agreement was forged. Nothing was said. No words were needed. It was a look, a touch, a shared breath in the frozen darkness. It was the acceptance of a truth that had no name, a life that had no rules but the ones they would make for themselves. It was unorthodox, and the world would surely condemn it. But in the shelter of the hayloft, it felt real and right. When the storm finally broke, they emerged into a world of blinding white and brilliant sun. The cabin was damaged but not destroyed. The next day was spent in shared, quiet labor. They shoveled the snow from the doorway. Eli climbed onto the roof to assess the damage while Annabelle and Clara worked together below, clearing the snow and ruined belongings from the cabin floor. They moved with a new, unspoken understanding, a quiet contentment settling over them. The air was cleared, both outside and in. In the days that followed, a new life began. Eli took Clara out and taught her properly how to shoot, not just for hunting, but for protection. He saw the grim satisfaction on her face as she learned to handle the weapon, a tool that gave her a power she had never known. Annabelle, in turn, took Eli's heavy sheepskin coat, the one he had shared with them during the first storm, and painstakingly mended the seam that had begun to tear at the shoulder. She worked by the fire, her movements calm and purposeful, restoring the thing that had first sheltered them. One evening, they sat together at the table, the cabin warm and clean, the smell of Annabelle's stew filling the air. Clara was cleaning the rifle, her movements efficient. Eli was watching the fire. Annabelle was darning a sock. The scene was one of impossible domesticity. A quiet peace held them. Annabelle looked up and her eyes met Eli's. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then she looked at Clara, who glanced up from her work and held her gaze for a long moment, a flicker of understanding passing between them. In that quiet, fire-lit moment, with the vast, frozen wilderness outside and the three of them safe within, it felt, for the first time, like it might all work. It felt like they might just survive. The peace was a thin sheet of ice over a deep, cold river, and the first crack came with the spring thaw, as the snow receded and the land turned from white to a muddy brown. The world beyond their small homestead began to stir. The trail to Dead Horse Gulch became passable again, and with the traffic of trappers and prospectors came the unavoidable flow of gossip. The story of Eli Carver and his two brides had festered all winter in the town's imagination, growing more lurid and scandalous with each retelling in the saloon and over the sewing circles. Their quiet, hard-won harmony was a fragile thing, not built to withstand the harsh judgment of the outside world. The first stone was cast by Mr. Jedediah Thornhill. He was a cattleman who owned the largest spread in the county, a man whose wealth and influence had made him the self-appointed guardian of the town's morality. He was a stern, church-going man with a face like a clenched fist and eyes that saw sin in every shadow. He had watched Eli's defiance from the start, his disapproval hardening into a righteous indignation. An unmarried man living with two women was an affront to God and a stain on the community's good name. It was an arrangement, he declared to anyone who would listen, that bred idleness and vice. He did not keep his opinions to himself. He rode out to the sheriff's office, his back ramrod straight on his expensive saddle, and filed a formal complaint. Sheriff Brody, a weary man who had seen too much to be easily shocked, read the document with a heavy sigh. Thornhill had couched his complaint in the language of the law, citing territorial statutes about vagrancy, public nuisance, and the improper use of a homestead claim. He claimed Eli Carver's homestead was not a place of honest labor, but a house of vice, a blight on the landscape that threatened the decency of their growing community. Sheriff Brody rode out to Eli's place a few days later. He did not come with fire in his eyes, but with a tired reluctance. He found Eli mending a fence line, his hands working with their usual steady competence. Annabelle was hanging laundry. the clean white sheets a stark banner of domesticity against the grim landscape. Clara was in the corral, patiently working with a new filly. The scene was one of quiet industry, not the den of iniquity Thornhill had described. "Eli," the sheriff said, dismounting, "I am not here on a friendly visit." He explained the situation. His words blunt and without embellishment. Thornhill was stirring up trouble. Using his influence with the land office, he was demanding an official inquiry. "He wants you to choose one and send the other packing," Brody said, kicking at a clump of dirt. "Says it is the only decent thing to do. If you do not, he is threatening to have your claim revoked." Eli's hands, which had been deftly twisting wire, went still. A cold, quiet anger, more dangerous than any loud outburst, settled in his eyes. "This is my land," he said, his voice low. "I proved up on it fair and square. What I do here is my business." "Not according to Thornhill," the sheriff replied. "And he has got the ear of men who matter." He looked from Eli to the cabin, where he could see the two women watching them, their faces pale with apprehension. He lowered his voice. "Look, Eli, I know you are a good man, but this is not a situation that can last. People will not stand for it. You need to sort it out, and soon." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving his warning hanging in the cold spring air. The second blow fell on Annabelle, and it came from a world she thought she had left behind. The mail rider brought a letter, its envelope edged in black, the handwriting familiar and severe. It was from her late husband's older brother, a man who had always disapproved of her. She took it with trembling fingers and read it behind the barn, where no one could see her face. The words were a torrent of pious cruelty. Her family had heard rumors, carried by a traveler from the territories, of her disgraceful new life. They wrote of the shame she had brought upon her late husband's heroic name, of her fall from grace. They did not ask for her side of the story. They pronounced judgment. They demanded she return to Georgia at once, to live out her days under their roof in penitence and humility. If she refused, they would not hesitate to take legal action, to have her declared a woman of loose morals, unfit to carry their name, and to seize what little inheritance her husband had left her. The letter was not an invitation. It was a summons, a reassertion of their ownership over her life. She crumpled the letter in her fist, a strangled sob escaping her lips. For months, she had been building a new self in this harsh land, a woman of quiet strength and surprising resilience. With a few strokes of a pen, her brother-in-law had tried to tear it all down, to force her back into the cage of shame and dependency she had fled. The third assault, quieter but no less devastating, was aimed at Clara, a traveling preacher, a gaunt man with eyes that burned with zealous fire. Stopped at the cabin one afternoon seeking a dipper of water. He saw the two women and the one man, and his face hardened into a mask of righteous condemnation. He drank the water, then fixed his gaze on Clara, perhaps sensing in her the most defiant spirit. He spoke to her of fire and brimstone, of the sanctity of marriage ordained by the Almighty. He called their home a nest of sin, a mockery of God's law. "You are a young woman," he said, his voice a low, intense rasp. "There is still time to save your soul from eternal damnation." He leaned closer, his breath smelling of dust and conviction. "But if you stay in this place, in this unholy arrangement, you will be cast out. When you stand before the pearly gates, your name will not be known. God will not recognize you." His words were meant to terrify, and they did. Clara had never been a church-going woman, but she had been raised with a deep, inborn fear of God's wrath. The preacher's pronouncement was not just a threat of hell. It was a threat of utter annihilation, of being erased from the book of life itself. He was gone as quickly as he came, a black-coated specter vanishing back down the trail, but his words lingered like a poison in the air. The cabin, once their sanctuary, now felt like a fortress under siege. The outside world, with its laws, its family ties, and its God, was pressing in on them, demanding they fall apart. Eli was consumed by a helpless fury. His anger was a hot, useless stone in his gut. He knew how to fight a blizzard, a rustler, or a stubborn piece of land. But how did you fight a rumor? How did you fight a letter full of righteous spite? How did you defend something that had no name? He looked at the two women who had become the center of his world, and he saw the new fear in their eyes. Annabelle was pale and withdrawn, her gentleness curdling into a brittle anxiety. Clara was quiet, her usual fiery defiance banked down to a smoldering dread. He knew he was the cause. He had brought them here. He had allowed this impossible situation to take root. But the knowledge did not change the simple, undeniable truth he had admitted to Annabelle. He did not want either of them gone. To send one away now would feel like cutting off a limb. Losing Annabelle would be losing the quiet grace that had soothed the ragged edges of his soul. Losing Clara would be losing the fierce, untamed spirit that mirrored his own. Losing either would break the strange, three-stranded cord that had become their lifeline. The breaking point came one evening. Annabelle had been silent all through supper, pushing her food around her plate. After, as Eli mended a harness and Clara sharpened a knife, Annabelle suddenly burst into tears. It was not her usual quiet weeping, but a storm of gut-wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. "I cannot do it," she gasped, the crumpled letter from her in-laws clutched in her hand. "I cannot go back there. They will shame me. They will lock me away. Eli, please, do not make me go. Do not send me away." She fell to her knees before him, her face buried in her hands. Her carefully constructed composure shattered into 1,000 pieces. Eli dropped the harness and knelt in front of her. He put his hands on her shoulders, feeling the tremors that ran through her. He had no words of comfort, no easy solutions. All he had was his own stubborn refusal to be broken. He held her, simply held her, letting her cry herself out against his chest. Over her bent head, his eyes met Clara's. She was standing by the hearth, the knife forgotten in her hand, her face a mask of shared misery. She was not crying, but her eyes were dark with a pain that mirrored Annabelle's. She understood what it was to have nowhere to run. Eli tightened his hold on Annabelle. Then he spoke, his voice low and firm, meant for both of them. "Clara, come here." She hesitated for a moment, then crossed the floor and stood beside them. Eli did not let go of Annabelle, but he reached out a hand to Clara, his fingers closing around her arm. He pulled them both closer, a small, besieged circle in the middle of the room. He looked from one tear-streaked face to the other. "Listen to me," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. "We are strongest together. Do you understand? Together." It was not a plan. It was a creed. A declaration made in the face of a hostile world. Annabelle's sobs quieted to a shuddering breath. Clara's tense shoulders relaxed a fraction. In that moment, they were not rivals, not two women clinging to one man. They were a unit, a family forged in a crucible of hardship and necessity. The town, however, was not finished with them. Thornhill had pressed his case, and the matter was brought before an informal town council, held in the general store. After an hour of heated debate, they reached a verdict. It was a compromise, a solution they deemed both just and practical. They would hold a hearing before a traveling justice of the peace, who was due in 2 weeks. At that hearing, Eli Carver would be compelled to make a choice. He was to choose one of the women to be his legal wife. The other would be dismissed, provided with a one-way stagecoach ticket back east, and sent away for the good of the community. The news was delivered by Sheriff Brody, who looked as unhappy about it as they were. The town had given them an ultimatum. It had handed them a knife and ordered them to cut their own family in two. For 2 weeks, a heavy gloom hung over the cabin. They spoke little of the coming hearing, but it was always there, an unspoken dread that soured their food and haunted their sleep. They were being forced to play a game with rules they had not made, a game where the only outcome was loss. The morning of the hearing arrived, cold and gray. Annabelle laid out her best dress, the dark traveling gown she had arrived in. Clara put on the simple wool dress she had been married in her mind at least. They moved with a somber, quiet purpose. Eli shaved with extra care, his jaw set like granite. When it was time to go, they stood by the door, a moment of silent hesitation passing between them. The town expected one man and one woman. The town expected them to be broken. Eli looked at Annabelle, at the quiet resolve that had replaced her fear. He looked at Clara, at the defiant fire that had returned to her eyes. He straightened his shoulders. "We will go together," he said. And so they did. They rode into Dead Horse Gulch not as a man and his two problems, but as a united front. Eli sat tall on the wagon seat, with Annabelle on one side and Clara on the other. They held their heads high as they rode down the main street. The whispers started immediately, but for the first time, they did not sting. The stares were met with level gazes. Their arrival was an act of silent, collective defiance, and the town fell quiet, taken aback by their refusal to appear ashamed. That night, back at the cabin, the tension of the day gave way to a strange, quiet intimacy. The hearing was tomorrow. Their world might be torn apart by sundown. They ate their supper in near silence, but it was a comfortable silence, the silence of soldiers on the eve of a battle. After, they sat before the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the log walls. The world was reduced to this small, warm circle of light. Eli looked at Annabelle, her face soft and luminous in the firelight. He leaned over and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that spoke of gratitude and a deep, quiet affection. It was a kiss of comfort, a promise that he would not abandon her. Then he turned to Clara. Her face was set, her eyes watching the flames, her body braced for the fight to come. He reached out and cupped her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. He kissed her too. Her lips were firm, and the kiss was not gentle. It was a kiss of fierce loyalty, a recognition of the warrior spirit in her that he so admired. It was a kiss that said, "We will not break." He pulled back, his hands falling to his sides. The fire crackled, the only sound in the room. Then, Annabelle, her eyes shining with unshed tears, slowly reached her hand across the space between them and laid it on top of Clara's. Clara's head turned, her eyes wide with surprise. She looked down at their joined hands, one soft and pale, the other strong and chapped, and then she looked at Annabelle. A long, silent moment passed between them. Then, Clara's fingers curled, her hand turning to clasp Annabelle's. It was not a gesture of pity, but of partnership, a final, unspoken pact made in the warm glow of the firelight. On the very edge of their world, whatever came tomorrow, they would face it together. The general store in Dead Horse Gulch had never been so crowded. It was a public spectacle, just as the town had intended. Farmers in their Sunday best, ranchers with their hats in their hands, women fanning themselves with folded church programs despite the chill. They had all come to see the sinner, Eli Carver, brought to heel. The air was thick with the smell of sawdust, cured tobacco, and self-righteousness. The justice of the peace was a man named Abernathy, a circuit judge with a weary face and spectacles perched on the end of his nose. He sat behind a makeshift bench made of 2 barrels and a plank of wood. He looked at the trio standing before him, Eli in the center, flanked by Annabelle and Clara, with an expression that was more tired than judgmental. "Mr. Carver," the judge began, his voice dry as dust. "This is an irregular hearing, but these are irregular circumstances. The good people of this community have filed a complaint. They have also, in a spirit of Christian charity, offered a solution." He cleared his throat and read from a piece of paper. "It is the finding of the town council that you, Eli Carver, must choose one of these women to be your lawful, wedded wife. The other is to be provided passage and sent from this territory for the preservation of public decency and order. It is a simple, practical solution to a difficult problem. Now, which woman do you choose? A hush fell over the store. Every eye was on Eli. This was the moment of judgment, the climax of their winter-long drama. Mr. Thornhill stood near the front, his arms crossed, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. He was a man watching his will be done. Eli looked not at the judge, but at the faces in the crowd. He saw their curiosity, their condemnation, their certainty. Then he looked at Annabelle, who stood beside him with a quiet, terrified dignity. He looked at Clara, whose chin was lifted in a familiar gesture of defiance, her hand clenched into a fist at her side. They had faced blizzards and starvation and loneliness. They would not be broken by gossip and petty rules. He turned back to the judge. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried to every corner of the crowded room. "Your Honor," he began, his words slow and deliberate. "When I sent for a bride, I was a lonely man with an empty cabin. I built that cabin with my own hands. I cut the trees and notched the logs and raised the roof. I thought that made it a home, but I was wrong. A home is not just walls and a roof. It is warmth and it is life." He paused, drawing a deep breath. "These women came here with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a world of trouble behind them. They faced a winter that would have broken lesser folk. They learned to live on a hard piece of land, and they learned to live with each other. They put the food on the table. They mended the clothes on my back. They brought life into that empty space." He looked directly at Judge Abernathy, his gaze unflinching. "I built the cabin, sir, but it was them who made it a home. It is their home now, as much as it is mine." He straightened to his full height. "So, no, I will not pick. I will not be the one to cast either of them out of their own home. My decision is made." For a long moment, there was only stunned silence. The town had expected a confession, a difficult choice, perhaps a plea for mercy. They had not expected this. This was not submission. It was rebellion. Then, a low murmur rippled through the crowd. Thornhill's face went dark with fury. "This is an outrage," he boomed. "He is making a mockery of the law and of this town." Judge Abernathy held up a hand for silence. He looked at Eli for a long, calculating moment, then sighed and took off his spectacles, polishing them on his vest. "Mr. Carver," he said, his voice laced with resignation, "the law has its limits. I cannot force you to marry, nor can I, on my own authority, revoke your claim to your land based on gossip. The hearing is concluded." He banged a small gavel on the plank, a sound of finality. They walked out of the store into the pale afternoon light, leaving a hubbub of angry, frustrated voices behind them. They had won, but it was a hollow victory. They had defied the town, and the town would not forget it. As they were untying the wagon, Sheriff Brody approached them, his face grim. "That was a fool thing you did in there." "Eli," he said, his voice low. "A brave thing, but a fool thing." "It was the only thing to do," Eli said. "Maybe so," the sheriff conceded. "But you have made a powerful enemy of Jedediah Thornhill. The judge may be gone tomorrow, but Thornhill will still be here. He will not let this go. Be careful. The law can be slow, but a man with a grudge can be awful quick. There are unofficial ways of settling matters out here. Watch your backs." He tipped his hat and walked away, a man who had done his duty and now washed his hands of the consequences. The sheriff's warning proved prophetic. For 3 nights, an uneasy peace settled over the homestead. They were hyper-vigilant, starting at every creak of the cabin, every rustle in the brush. Eli kept his rifle cleaned and loaded by the door. Clara slept with a smaller rifle in the bunk beside her. The attack came on the 4th night. There was no moon, only a blanket of stars spread across a black sky. It was the deep, silent part of the night when the world feels dead. A frantic lowing from the cows in the barn was the first sound of trouble. Eli was awake in an instant. "Stay here. Bolt the door behind me," he whispered, pulling on his boots and grabbing his rifle. The women watched from the cabin's single window as he slipped out into the darkness. They saw the flicker of a torch near the barn. Then another. Figures moved in the shadows. A cold dread seized them. This was not a random drifter. This was planned. Eli was halfway to the barn when they came at him. Two men, emerging from the darkness on either side. He did not have time to raise his rifle before one of them swung a heavy wooden club, catching him hard in the ribs. The breath went out of him in a grunt of pain, and he staggered. He brought the butt of his rifle around, connecting with one man's jaw, but the other was on him, grappling for the weapon. Inside the cabin, Clara's face was a pale mask of fury. "They are going to kill him," she whispered. She did not hesitate. She grabbed the rifle from her bunk, her movements swift and sure. Annabelle stood frozen by the window, her hands pressed to her mouth, a silent scream trapped in her throat. Clara unbolted the door. "Stay back," she ordered, her voice as sharp and cold as a shard of ice. She slipped outside, keeping low to the ground, and crept along the side of the cabin until she had a clear view. Eli was on the ground, fighting with a desperate strength, but there were three of them now. One man was holding him down, while the other two kicked him with heavy boots. A fourth man, holding a torch and a can of kerosene, was splashing the fuel against the dry timber walls of the barn. In the flickering torchlight, Clara saw his face. It was Jebediah, the ranch hand she had punched in the store, and, standing off to the side, directing them, was the unmistakable, imposing figure of Jedediah Thornhill himself. Clara rested the rifle on the corner of the cabin to steady her aim. The world narrowed. She remembered Eli's words in the snow. "Breathe out slow. Squeeze the trigger." She put Jebediah in her sights. She did not aim for his head or his chest. She aimed for his leg. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report split the night. Jebediah screamed, a high, thin sound of shock and pain, and dropped the torch, clutching at his thigh as he crumpled to the ground. The torch sputtered in the dirt, inches from the kerosene-soaked wall. The attack on Eli stopped. The men looked up, stunned, searching the darkness for the source of the shot. In that moment of hesitation, Annabelle found a strength she never knew she possessed. The sight of Eli, lying broken on the ground, had extinguished every last bit of her fear, replacing it with a cold, protective rage. She turned from the window, her eyes falling on the old double-barreled shotgun Eli kept on the pegs above the door. She had never held a gun in her life. She pulled it down. It was heavier than she expected, her hands shaking. She unbolted the door and stepped out onto the porch. Raising the weapon, she did not know if it was loaded. She did not care. She pointed the wide, dark barrels directly at Mr. Thornhill. Her voice, when she spoke, did not tremble. It was a clear, ringing cry that cut through the night. "Get off this land," she commanded. "Get off this land now, or I swear before God Almighty I will shoot you where you stand." Thornhill stared at her, his face a mixture of shock and disbelief. This was not the timid, refined widow he had dismissed. This was a cornered she-cat, protecting her own. He looked at the shotgun, at the unwavering determination in her eyes. He looked at his man, bleeding on the ground. He looked at the darkness, not knowing who else might be out there with a rifle. The fight had gone out of him. He was a bully, not a soldier. "Get him up," he snarled to his men. "Let us go." They hauled the wounded Jebediah to his feet and dragged him away, melting back into the darkness from which they came. The moment they were gone, the strength drained out of Annabelle, and the shotgun suddenly felt impossibly heavy. She lowered it, her body trembling violently. Clara was already at Eli's side. He was conscious, but barely. He was a mess of cuts and bruises, and he was struggling to breathe, his ribs clearly broken. Together, the two women half carried, half dragged him back into the warmth and light of the cabin. They worked through the rest of the night, their movements a silent, synchronized dance of desperation and care. They stripped off his torn shirt and washed the blood from his face and chest. Clara fetched the pine-smelling salve and the clean linen for bandages. Annabelle boiled water and steeped a willow bark tea for the pain. One of his eyes was swollen shut, his lip was split, and a dark, ugly bruise was already purpling across his ribs. They wrapped his torso tightly, their hands brushing, their focus absolute. A new calf, born just that week, had been trampled in the panic and lay dead in the barn. The world had been reduced to this single, urgent task, saving him. In the deep, quiet hours before dawn, he finally fell into a restless, pain-filled sleep. The women sat by his bunk, their exhaustion a heavy weight. The lantern cast a soft, golden glow on the scene of devastation and survival. Annabelle began to weep. Quiet, exhausted tears for the violence, for the loss, for the sheer terror of the night. "We almost lost him," she whispered, her voice choked. "I love him, Clara. I love this life we have made. As hard as it is, I cannot lose it." Clara reached out and took her hand. It was the same gesture from the night before the hearing, but this time it felt different. It was not a pact for a battle to come. It was a bond sealed in a battle they had just survived. "I love him too," Clara said, her own voice rough with unshed tears. She looked at Annabelle, at her tear-streaked face, and a truth she had kept locked away in the deepest part of her heart finally broke free. "And I love you, too, Annabelle." The words were quiet, almost lost in the small cabin. Annabelle looked up, her eyes wide with shock. Clara rushed to explain, her words tumbling out in a fierce, tender whisper. Not in the way you might think. I do not know how to say it. I love you the way a soldier loves the one who fought beside her in the trenches. I love you for your courage. I saw you tonight. With that shotgun, I have never seen anything so brave." Annabelle trembled, a shock going through her entire body. She had spent a lifetime learning the proper shapes and names for love. There was no name for this feeling between them, this fierce, protective loyalty. She did not understand it, but as she looked at Clara's earnest, scarred knuckle hand holding hers, she knew it was real. She did not pull away. A low groan came from the bunk. Eli's one good eye was open. He had heard them. A faint, bruised smile touched his split lips. "We already survived worse," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "A blizzard, a winter of starving. We can survive them too." His words, spoken from a place of deep pain, were a balm to their frayed souls. He was right. They had already faced the uncaring wrath of nature. They could surely face the petty hatred of men. In the morning, the harsh light revealed the full extent of the night's damage. The barn wall was scorched, the kerosene smell still hanging in the air. In the corral lay the dead calf, a small, sad casualty of their war. They did not speak of the attack. There was nothing left to say. There was only work to be done. Together, they dug a hole in the still frozen soil and buried the calf. Clara cried, not just for the small, lost life, but for the loss of their peace. Eli, his ribs tightly bound, directed them as they began to repair the burned shed next to the barn. Annabelle brought them water. Clara hammered the new planks into place. Their shared labor was a prayer, a meditation, a way of stitching their shattered world back together. Every swing of the hammer, every shovelful of dirt, was an act of defiance. Their bond, which had been forged in the cold and the dark, was now tempered in fire and blood, deepening with every shared silence, every quiet promise to simply endure. They were broken, bruised, and mourning, but they were together. And for now, that was enough. Spring arrived not as a gentle guest, but as a messy, forceful thaw. The rivers, choked with ice, broke free with a roar, their muddy waters surging over the banks. The prairie, frozen solid for months, softened into a vast expanse of mud that clung to boots and wagon wheels. But with the mess came life. The pale, gray-green shoots of new grass pushed through the muck, and the cottonwood trees by the creek began to bud. The air, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, lost its bite, carrying instead the rich, damp smell of the earth waking up. The healing of the land mirrored their own. Eli's ribs mended slowly, the dark bruises on his body fading to a sickly yellow, then disappearing altogether. He moved with a slight stiffness at first, but each day brought a little more of his old strength back. The deeper wounds, the ones inside the three of them, also began to heal under the warming sun. The terror of the attack receded, leaving behind not a scar of fear, but a hard, solid foundation of shared survival. They had been tested by fire, and they had not burned. The peace that settled over the homestead was not the fragile, uncertain peace of before, but something earned and owned, a cautious but steady calm. One afternoon, Clara was walking the fence line, checking for posts loosened by the thaw. Her path took her past the small, unmarked mound of earth where they had buried the calf. She had avoided this spot, the memory of that night still a sharp pain. But today, something caught her eye. Pushing up through the dark soil, right at the edge of the grave, was a cluster of wildflowers. They were a tough, resilient prairie bloom, their petals a startling shade of deep, hopeful blue. She stopped, staring at them. Life, springing from a place of death, beauty, from a place of violence and loss. She remembered her tears that day, the feeling of utter desolation. Now, without thinking, she knelt in the damp earth and gently picked them, their stems cool and firm in her hand. She carried them back to the cabin, not as a decoration, but as an offering. Annabelle was kneading dough at the table, her hands dusted with flour. She looked up as Clara entered. Then her eyes fell to the small, vibrant bouquet. Clara said nothing, but walked to the table and laid the flowers down beside a worn wooden bowl. Annabelle looked from the flowers to Clara's face, and a slow, beautiful smile spread across her own. She washed the flower from her hands, found an old glass jar, and filled it with water. She arranged the wildflowers with a careful, tender touch and placed the jar in the center of the table. It was the first truly beautiful thing their cabin had ever held, a small, blue promise that things could grow again. That night, a different kind of seed was planted. They sat by the hearth, the fire casting a warm, flickering glow. Annabelle held a small, leather-bound book in her hands. It was a book of simple poems she had managed to keep with her. Clara was watching the flames, her expression thoughtful. "I wish I knew what they said," Clara said quietly, nodding toward the book. "The words." Annabelle looked at her, a new idea taking shape in her eyes. "I could teach you," she offered, her voice soft. "I could teach you to read." Clara's head snapped up. She had always thought of reading as something for other people, for soft-handed ladies in the East. For her, letters were just shapes on a page, as meaningless as cattle brands. "I am too old to learn," she said, a hint of her old defensiveness in her tone. "Nonsense," Annabelle said gently. "No one is too old to learn something new." She opened the book to the first page. "Come, sit here." And so began the lessons. Night after night, by the light of the fire, Annabelle's patient voice would sound out the letters, her finger tracing the words on the page. Clara, her brow furrowed in concentration, would lean close, her lips moving silently as she tried to piece the sounds together. It was slow, frustrating work, but in that shared, quiet space, something profound was happening. Annabelle was giving Clara a key to a world she had never known, and Clara, in her fierce determination to learn, was giving Annabelle a purpose beyond chores and survival. Their heads would often be bent close together over the book, a strand of Annabelle's red hair sometimes brushing Clara's blonde braid. It was an intimacy of the mind, a new and powerful thread woven into the complex tapestry of their lives. As the weeks turned into months, they noticed a change on their rare trips into town. The story of the attack on Eli's homestead had spread, and though no one could prove it was Thornhill, everyone knew. The man from the saloon whom Clara had shot in the leg now walked with a permanent limp, a walking advertisement for the consequences of crossing the folks at the Carver place. The town's opinion, which had been a solid wall of condemnation, began to show cracks. It is hard to hate hardworking people who mind their own business, and it is even harder when you know they will fight, and fight fiercely, to protect what is theirs. The whispers did not stop entirely, but their tone began to change. The scandal was becoming a legend. The stares were now tinged not with scorn, but with a kind of grudging respect, even awe. Mr. Thornhill was a diminished figure in the town, a man whose cruelty had been met with a courage that had bested him. He kept his distance. One day in late summer, a dusty wagon pulled up to the cabin. It belonged to a wandering photographer, a thin, energetic man with ink-stained fingers and a portable darkroom in the back of his wagon. He was documenting the faces and places of the territory. He explained, for a book. He had heard the story of their homestead in town, and he was intrigued. "I would be honored," he said, gesturing to his large, tripod-mounted camera, "to take a portrait of you, the three of you, a document of the frontier family." They hesitated. To have their picture taken was to be seen, to be recorded, to have their impossible arrangement captured forever on a plate of glass. It felt like a dangerous thing. But then Eli looked at Annabelle and Clara, at the strength and confidence they now wore as easily as their homespun dresses. He looked at the cabin they had defended and the land they had bled for. He nodded. The photographer positioned them on the porch of the cabin. Eli stood in the center, solid as an oak. He put one arm around Annabelle's waist, and she leaned into his side, a quiet smile on her face. He put his other arm around Clara's shoulders, and she stood tall and straight, her hand resting on the porch rail, a look of proud defiance in her eyes. They were a strange, beautiful, impossible sight. "Now, hold very still," the photographer said, his head disappearing under a black cloth. Just before the flash of powder, as Eli looked straight into the unblinking glass eye of the lens, he felt the solid warmth of the two women who were his world. He thought of the town's laws, the preacher's warnings, the judgment of the world, and he thought of the simple, undeniable truth of their lives together. He leaned in and said, so softly that only Annabelle and Clara could hear, "This is the only law I care about now." The final, quiet healing came on a night in early autumn. A storm rolled in, a cleansing rain that drummed on the roof and washed the dust from the world. It was a gentle storm, not a violent one, and it shut them in, cocooning them in their small, safe world. The fire crackled, the rain whispered against the window pane, and a deep peace settled in the room. That night, in the wide bunk bed, the last of the barriers between them finally dissolved. There were no words, no grand declarations. There was only the sound of the rain and their breathing, a quiet rhythm in the darkness. An arm reached out, a hand was taken, a body shifted, making room for another. In the warm, tangled nest of quilts, they came together, not in a frenzy of passion, but with a slow, sacred tenderness. It was a quiet exploration of a truth they had lived for months, a final acceptance of their three-part harmony. Every touch was an echo of a shared meal, every kiss a memory of a battle fought together, every joining a testament to the home they had made in each other. With the world shut out by the storm, they lay tangled and bare, their bodies speaking a language of love that had no words. It was not shameful. It was earned. It was sacred. The cabin and its occupants became a legend. At first, the story was told in hushed whispers in the saloon. Then, as years passed, it was told with a kind of laughter and wonder around campfires. Eventually, it was told with respect, It became the story of the cowboy who had two brides, and of the two women who were tough enough to make a life where no one thought they could. It was a story about a love that broke every rule and survived. One evening, many seasons later, Clara stood on the porch, watching the sun set, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple. Eli stood beside her, his arm resting comfortably around her shoulders. Annabelle was inside, humming as she lit the lamps. It was a scene of deep, abiding peace. Then Clara saw it, a lone wagon, moving slowly across the darkening prairie, heading directly for their cabin. It stopped a short distance away, and a figure climbed down. It was a woman, young and alone. She stood for a long moment, staring at the light glowing in their window, her posture a portrait of fear and desperation. She clutched a small bundle to her chest and took a tentative, hesitant step forward. Annabelle appeared at the open cabin door, the warm lamplight spilling out around her. She saw the woman, and her humming stopped. She did not look surprised, only compassionate. Clara looked at the stranger, at the familiar terror in her eyes, and she knew. She was another runaway, another soul seeking a sanctuary from a cruel world. Clara looked at Eli, and then at Annabelle in the doorway. She gave a single, firm nod. This was what they had built. Not just a home for themselves, but a haven. Eli stepped forward. Standing beside Annabelle on the porch, the three of them stood there together, a silent, welcoming trinity. The story ends here, but it does not truly end. It ends with the light of their cabin glowing ever brighter as the prairie darkness deepens, a steady, unwavering beacon for a love that makes its own laws, and for all the lost souls searching for a place to finally come home. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect. Please subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts with us in English.